Welcome everyone to episode 10 of The Way, a RUDIS Wrestling broadcast. And I'm with our co-host Cary, myself, Matt Dernlan, and we are jumping back into Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard, a book by Chip and Dan Heath. And we're kind of getting to the back end of the book. And I think, in this chapter, Cary, it's kind of, by this point in the book, you're kind of not recycling ideas, but this is where, the whole book kind of comes together, and, all the building blocks in the previous 9 chapters are trying to are slowly coming together, and to provide a seamless philosophy about how to introduce change and how to effectively enact change within a group. And so I guess we're at the back end of the season now, and you're in the postseason now, but at some points, this is a time of reflection at this time of the year, but also, as we're trying to combine some of the narratives in this chapter, it'll be interesting to see what we pull out of this discussion.
Yeah, yeah. It does get a little redundant, but I think anything that's has a solid foundation, you come back to it and you come back to it and you keep reinforcing it. And I think that's what they did here in the book. And there's always something, different in each chapter. But in the end, the book is about getting an organization, not just getting one individual. I mean, it starts with the individual, but getting an organization of guys, or whether it's a business or whether it's a team, getting them all moving in the same direction and following the same path, and developing the same attitude and philosophy within all of them. But not so much that you kill the individual in the process, but you got to have everybody working in sync and going in the same direction. And so when you get to this part, it may be a little redundant, but it's important that they keep going back to it, I believe, I just had one of these kind of questions the other night. Matt was on, it was actually just the last ASK KOLAT one, and it was about competitiveness, and if you can build competitiveness, and this, goes back to this chapter in terms of getting the herd going in the same direction. And, and when I spoke in the segment, I was talking about how I like to try to control the environment as much as I can, from how everybody thinks, from the weigh-in, from the handshake to the fans in the stand, communicating with everybody that's involved in our program, so we're all on the same page. And and that was the goal. I would tell you this: going into the NCAA tournament, I was talking to my guys, and I was talking to our supporters and our donors, and I told them, I said we need 11 to 12 wins to be a top 20 team. That's what we needed. And so I was trying to lay the groundwork, and that we had people, tweeting out and hashtagging Run Deep, when we were going out to compete on Twitter and Facebook. And, but that was my goal, was to get everybody thinking the same way. So anytime one of my guys came in contact with a fan of the Campbell program or a donor of the Campbell program, like they knew the plan, and they knew what we needed to do, and everybody could talk about it. And that gets people excited, and makes it more likely that you're going to achieve it. Now, we didn't achieve it, but it makes it more likely, and it gives us a better chance. And, I think that's where this chapter helped me during, the end of the season.
Right, and I think, similar to the book, at this point in the book, there is some redundancy in the messaging, but I think there's also redundancy in your coaching philosophy and the message that you have to communicate, that you have to repeat this over and over and over again until it becomes like rote memory to your guys, and rote memory for your donors and your supporters, that they know you're not switching things up. There's got to be a consistency and a continuity to your message, so that they, over time, because, you know, as the book always talks about, change is hard. And so when you can, a lot of times people knee jerk and think, well, this isn't working, so I got to jump into this. Well, I mean, over time, you've got to, as a coach, you've got to have a firm depth and understanding in what your philosophy is. And you got to understand that, it's not going to take, it's going to take more than just a year. When you're talking about the wins, it's going to take, to be a top 20 team, that's not going to change from this year to next. Next year, it's going to take the same amount of wins. And so when you articulate that over time, it's something that people can adapt to and they understand more and more consistently. And they've got that level of understanding, that's built up over time, that you don't just say one thing, over the course of a season and then you change the message and the topic, to next season. So I think there's got to be, transferable messaging that goes from season to season, even though you can make minor tweaks throughout. Fundamentally, the messaging has to be the same from year to year.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, after this, the final tournament, and you've heard me say it enough. The mistake is building everything up to March, right? It's about training and having your guys in sync and doing the same things each week and getting better at those things and adding where you need to add and without saying, hey, it all matters in March, right? So in the end, I'm the person it matters to in March. Like at the end of the season, that's where I look back and say, okay, did I have a successful season or not? For my guys, I look at the individual and I say, he may not have been the national champion, but did he have a successful season? And so I don't weigh him on that one event. I look at his body of work over the course of the season. But for myself, as the leader of the program, I have to, I put more weight at the end as a measurement for our fans and recruiting. And so right after that tournament was over, I was back in my hotel room before everything left my mind and said with my staff and said, okay, what are the things that we got to improve on? And I think for us for next season, one of our points that has to be driven to affect change in our team is body language. I don't think kids realize how important body language is when you're competing, when you're in the practice room, and having guidelines to that, like reinforce it. Who was the coach? Who was Michael Jordan's coach at UNC? I'm not a basketball guy, but famous coach. He just passed
Dean
away.
Dean Dean Smith.
Dean,
Dean Smith.
yeah, Dean Smith had this thing that they did all the time, and I'm sure it was more annoying to those guys because they did so many. Yeah, I don't know if it was every time they missed a foul shot, they went down the court one time, and this was in practice, right? It was just, and I think I have to establish some of those things in practice in terms of body language, because I know as a competitor, when I'm sitting in an arena and back as an athlete, I would, I might watch if I didn't know a guy, I would watch a match if I had the chance to. I'd watch him in competition, and the things that I knew my wrestling wasn't going to change. It didn't matter to me what he did. My wrestling wasn't going to change. What I particularly paid attention to was how far does he go? When does he stop pushing? And you'd say, okay, well, this guy shuts down, halfway through the second period, or when we get to the third period, I know this guy's got nothing left. Those were things that I used to gain energy before that match, and it's important that I tell my guys all the time, your body language is everything, because you may not be wrestling that guy now, but believe me, he's watching, and you're fueling his fire. If when there's a timeout, when some guy's hurt, you got to sit down and take a knee. Or, I hate the guy that does the hands and knees and crawls back to the center. I'm like, get up and get there. Not that my guys were doing that. But those are things that I look at. And when you have a standard to the way you carry yourself, that also is going to come out in your wrestling, and so I think I have to have some practice guidelines on body language, some competition guidelines on body language, some kind of reinforcement when, hey, if you're beat back to the center, we're doing sprints. I stole that one from my assistant coach. Like at Central Michigan, Borelli's been there a long time. He's had some up and down teams, but he's had some really good teams. And, he said one of those things they used to do is a statistician used to count how many times the other guy beat you back to the center, and then, when you get back in practice, you were doing sprints for every time you got beat, whatever that number is. I mean, just things like that really start to change your culture and your mindset of your guys.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think to your point, that starts in the practice room, right? I mean, those were behaviors that I would always discuss with my guys consistently, day in and day out, you know, in between goes. Like, you know, I never in between goes, I never let guys sit down on the wall. They were always walking. And when they were walking, you know, we would say things all the time. Don't show it. Show your attitude every day. Head up, shoulders back. Don't put your hands on your head. Don't put your hands on your waist. Don't put your hands on your knees. Right.
Yeah.
And so when you're introducing those things on a daily basis when they're having to consciously think about those things, that they're not showing emotion, they're not showing weakness, they're not giving any tells away. So I would try and condition that in the practice room, so when it gets into competition, when you're saying hustle back to center, it's an instinct. They hear that cue and they're running back to the center. When they go out of bounds, they're not taking that break where they're putting their hands on their knees, or they're putting their hands on their head, because those are things your competitors are always picking up. And especially in big time situations at the NCAA tournament, there may be things that you picked up when you're breaking down tape that can provide insight to your your opponent lowering his guard. Like, oh, I'm getting to him, his hands are on his head, he's showing it in his face, he's walking back to center, he's slow to get to the starting line. Those are things that, if you're talking about those things on a consistent basis, that's where you pick up tendencies and weaknesses from your opponent as well. And
Yeah.
so I think it definitely, I mean, it's got to start in the practice room, and you've got to make that a point of emphasis every single day before you can expect your guys to be displaying that same attitude in competition.
Right. Right. Yeah. And we're talking about body language is just one way to get everybody moving in the same direction. I go back to that question I had and concerning competitiveness and look, I'd rather the environment be hostile every time we go somewhere. It's wrestling, nobody's dying, we're not going to war, right? But I really love like an environment where everybody wants to beat you. Everybody wants to get you, because I feel like as a coach, if I can go into a facility and I know that the fans don't like us, and I know that the other team doesn't like it, and the coaches don't like us, then I can get my guys like behind that. Hey, it's us versus everyone in this arena right now. And that was kind of some of the things that we tried to put into our guys this year, in terms of how we got them moving in the same direction and got them thinking, and really up their level of wrestling, in certain events and in certain situations and in certain individuals. Because when everybody's thinking the same way, you don't want to be the guy that screws it up. And we had some great events because of that, and so I guess you could say it's kind of like when you went to Iowa. If you wrestled, man, those fans hated you, right? Like, I mean, back in my day, it was Iowa. I don't know. I haven't wrestled in the Penn State arena since it was, they've changed their program. But I remember going to Iowa and fans just yelling your name and screaming insults at you, and I loved it. I loved it. It got me fired up, and I feel like a lot of my teammates, we got fired up and competed better in that environment than we did. And we've also seen some people implode, and in an environment like that sometimes. But that's just another way of getting people to move, is based on emotion, which in the book they talk about the elephant. And emotion is that probably the strongest characteristic or the strongest part of the human mind in terms of drive. When somebody's upset or angry about something, you get them to go in the same direction, or if it's very touching to them, they'll move for you. And as a coach, those are the things you got to try to figure out. How do I get these guys moving, and how do I get the emotion and get everybody on the same emotion, moving in the same direction?
Yeah, because back to your point about getting comfortable in hostile environments, I think one of the mistakes some competitors make going into last week is they think, you know, heading into an NCAA arena for the NCAA championships, it's going to be a neutral environment, and it's not neutral at all. I mean, you've got these big fan bases that follow their programs, and when you're wrestling one of the those one of the traditional powers, thinking back to last weekend, when a Penn State guy stepped on the mat, or an Iowa guy stepped on the mat, or an Ohio State or an Okie State guy, there was a bias in the arena, right? If you're
Right.
if you're from a mid-tier program or a smaller program that doesn't carry a fan base as much, like I was thinking about, when some of those guys were stepping on the mat against one of those guys from Penn State. I mean, that was a hostile environment that you had to face against, because you had, it's seemingly the whole crowd against you. And so how are you going to deal in that situation? And if you've been accustomed to putting yourself into adverse environments, hostile environments, you're comfortable in that moment because you've been exposed to that on multiple times throughout the year. So it's not different. That stage isn't different.
Right. Well, for us, it was the opposite. Just going back to my program, right, mid-major program. So in our conference, I felt like everybody wanted to knock us off. So we treated it as a hostile environment. That's what we told our guys to be ready for. We said everybody's going to be rooting against you. Nobody wants to see you win. And and you saw that unfold over the course of the conference tournament. We were the better team, not significantly better. It was a close race, but we saw other teams grouping up and rooting against us. You know what I mean? Because everybody wants to see the somebody lose. You know what I mean? If you're more or less expected to be the front runner, right? But for the NCAA tournament, for us, it was the opposite. I went the other way and said, look, you're going into the NCAA tournament, and people have recognized where this program started at and where it's at now and how it's solidifying itself. I said, you're kind of like the underdog, right? Like, we had people cheering for us. I remember Josh Heil pinned his kid in the first round of the NCAA tournament. And I told them, I said, you're going to have 10,000, Campbell fans you watch if you get out there and wrestle. And, Josh pinned his guy. The place went crazy. So we used the opposite. We went from one end of the emotion spectrum for the conference to the other end for the NCAA tournament to get these guys ready. Now, we didn't have the tournament we wanted to have, but for us, it was the opposite. And that was just another thing I was using to try to get them all on the same page and get them all competing, at a high level.
Now let me ask you this, Cary. Like, all guys are different. And were there some of your guys that you felt like maybe I need to tweak the message? This is like, if we go out there and compete, we go out there and score points and put an exciting product on the mat, we're going to have a bunch of fans, behind us. But, were there any of your guys that are wired a little bit differently than the rest of your group that you actually had to tweak the message
Yeah,
personally for them?
Yeah, and a few of my guys, I think they're all pretty distinct. The guys I took to the national tournament, I think they're all pretty distinct, and we all had our individual messages with them. Like our 25-pounder, he's a smiler, man. That's our big joke. I always joke with them and say, okay, go 5 seconds without smiling. As soon as you say that to him, he can't stop. And and that's his mindset. He does his worst wrestling when it's a tense environment, if he makes it tense. And so, our message to him was always do what you do in practice, my 57-pounder, like I can get in competition. I'm that guy that likes to shake your arms and smack you around and get you going. And he's the opposite. He says, coach, just tell me jokes before I go out there. You know what I mean? So for each guy, it was different. My 57-pounder, first time to the NCAA tournament, he was a walk-on from Kentucky. And has just made leaps and bounds since he's been here and got to the NCAA tournament. Now, he didn't have the tournament he wanted to have, but he's not satisfied with that. He's definitely not back saying, yeah, I reached my goal. That's why I love that guy. He was a walk-on, got the nationals. He's not satisfied with just getting there. My 49-pounder, his brother's a two-time national champ. He's for him, it's constantly getting him to relax because he wants to be a national champion so bad that it can eat him up when things don't go right, and it's a process, and he's getting better, but it's still a process for him. My 74-pounder, first time went to the NCAAs as an alternate last year. His message was different. And then my 84, same thing. He was a walk-on and made it to the national tournament. He didn't have such a great tournament. I think he might have got a little shell-shocked from his wrestling, but he's going to improve from it. So yeah, we had to tailor the message individually, specifically for some guys, and then there was a few guys that they were always on the same page.
Yeah, and I think in general, right? I mean, overall, the overall message is the same. And I think, especially in those big stages, and we've talked about it for the last several weeks, like, I think it's critical that you have an overall message that the group can latch on to, like a unifying statement about what you're going to be at this tournament and how you're going to compete. And obviously that starts in the practice room at the beginning of the year. It's reinforced throughout the year in competition. But then, that statement, that mantra that you've been talking to is great, but then you have to recognize, I think that's maybe where coaches fall short a little bit, is like everybody, when you can personalize the message, it's a lot more meaningful. The overall unifying voice of the group is great, but then when you can individualize that same message in a personal way that each person can latch onto, it you know it makes the message even more tangible, more valuable, and more relatable to each guy.
Yeah.
And I think that's a critical thing. I mean, it takes a lot more work because that takes individual investment. You really have to understand, how each guy is wired, what little change in the environment can throw them off, and how to recognize those things and get them back to center. I think that's, because the NCAA tournament, there's distractions everywhere, right? And so as much as you want to contain the environment and close it in, there's distractions abound everywhere. So you got to be cognizant of those distractions, where they could come from, because whether it's a fan in the stand or, someone trying to get your attention, I think you've got to be cognizant about how the environment changes, what distractions can be out there, and, kind of rally it back and center it to the point that, that individual message that they can latch on to throughout the weekend and through the course of the season.
Yeah, yeah. My 33 pounder is a transfer from Eastern Michigan, and they had 5 guys, um, which would have been impressive, right? Think about Eastern Michigan, where they were, and Bullard was doing a good job. He had 5 guys from his former team, all wrestling on different programs now, right? And so we got the benefit of his work. But for him, it was going in, and he's a goer at 133. He's a go guy, which is, if he gets beat, he'll get beat because he doesn't know when to back off sometimes, and will force a position or make a mistake, or just, he's got one gear, and that's what we're trying to do, is give him more gears where he knows where sometimes it's better to back off. But individually, those guys were all wrestling for the, in the name of Eastern Michigan to some extent. They wanted to just really keep showing that administration the mistake they made, and so we used that with him. We told him, look, your program, you didn't transfer. He loved Eastern Michigan. Your program got yanked out from underneath of you. We got the benefit of it. We love them, and but show those, that administration the mistake they made, and so that's emotion, right? That's emotion. It's
Yeah.
just something else to get somebody going. And so, back to your prior question about individual messages, that was something that we used with him throughout the year, and like I said, we love having him, and we got the benefit of Bullard's work, and now we're just trying to, tweak him and keep helping him reach his goal, because he wants to get it all.
So that's an interesting dynamic, and I think it's something that, every coach has to deal with, is the transfer athlete. And so what year was this guy from
He's a
Eastern
junior.
Michigan?
Yeah, junior,
Okay,
he
so
spent 3 years.
a junior. So he had 3 years in a program where they were probably talking about things slightly different than what you would talk to things at Campbell. So how did you balance that between introducing him to your culture, your philosophy, your vision, but also taking some things? Were you able to take things and incorporate some things, from how he was trained, and how he was guided his previous 3 years? Did you
No,
pull
Noah's.
some things from that?
Well, then what you got to, the real thing you have to ask me, when I look at the guys who, for the most part, have done the best in my program, who have done the best. And because you sit back and you look at recruiting and say, okay, what are the traits of the guys that we have they're having success in changing our program? What do they have? And Matt, it always comes back to the same, like they're the kids I don't have to worry about. I don't have to worry about them going to class. I don't have to worry about them doing extra. I don't have to worry about them coming into practice and going, like, right. They have that quality of being extremely self-driven for the most part. And if they don't come in with that, they don't start that way their freshman year. They learn it from those other guys who are having success. That's the difference with them, right? And now, if you're asking me if I learned a lot from Noah, Noah, he's like 50 years old, man, at 22. And he walks in, he wears like a Fonzie leather jacket. I mean, he's just like an old guy. We always joke with him, but he doesn't say much. He just works out. He just trains. You know what I mean? So in terms of implementing him into our room, that was easy. Because the majority of the guys we got having success are workers. And that's pretty much my philosophy and style, that we're going to get the reps in and we're going to keep tightening up, and that's Noah. There some tweaks we had to do with him, just more on style, not an Eastern Michigan thing. And but he fit extremely well. There was never a problem with him. And if anything, the only problem we ever had with him was when he came in the summer and we were remodeling our room and we were working out in different locations. And I think he got frustrated because he just wanted to train and train and train. And getting him to be patient was probably the hardest thing, but that's a high quality problem as a coach to have, because a guy wants to work out and he doesn't feel like he's getting it adequately because we were in the middle of a remodel of our wrestling room.
Right. And I think what you were talking to there with, introducing a transfer, a new guy into your program, one of the points in the book that I thought was really good is, when you're trying to convert new believers, is what Dan and Chip were talking about, rallying the herd. And they said a lot of times, and I think this is a tendency for a lot of coaches or a lot of leaders. You want to control everything, right? And
Right.
and that's a tendency that you've got to recognize in yourself, that may not be the healthiest things at all times. Like, hey, I know my vision, I know my message is right. I need to get everybody to embrace it right away. And I think force feeding that, I mean, kids will do what you say, right? Because you're the coach. You're making the rules, you're setting the standards, you're setting how you approach every practice and every outcome. But, one thing that they said in the book, a lot of times, instead of trying to convert the new believers, unleash the believers you have already, and let the new believer the new people gradually embrace what the first adapters are already doing. So let them see and recognize, instead of like forcing them to do something, introduce the thought, but also let them, you know, take in the environment. And most of these guys that are high achievers, like Gonzer, he's a motivated guy. He wants to win, and when he comes into the program, he's naturally going to be attracted to those other high achievers, right? So you
Right.
don't, the tendency, I think, as a coach is like, I've got this new guy, and I've got to tell him how it is, and I got to get him to buy into what we're doing. It's like, hey, it's a lot easier for long term growth if you let them seek out the people that they're attracted to. And if you're, to your point, if you're recruiting the right type of guy that's driven and motivated the right way, they're going to get pulled up to the 1% automatically, right?
Yeah.
And so that takes a leap of faith to understand that you've recruited the right guys consistently over a period of time, and if you can continue to recruit the right guy, they're going to get pulled up, by the adapters and the believers that are already ingrained and bought into your culture right away.
Right. This is where I go back my younger days of being a coach, and I've seen assistant coaches do it back when I was their age, and do it to this day. But you can't judge a kid, and especially in D1 wrestling, you can't judge him by his first season. You can't label that kid in his first season. I've seen so many guys in my program that the first year I wasn't extremely happy with their training habits, or their academics maybe, or what I thought was a lack of dedication or discipline to the program. But then you see them in a year make the change, and you could say it's a freshman thing too. But I've also seen it. I know you've heard the term, sophomore blues, is another thing. We've seen guys have a great freshman year. And I always say that's first time away from mom and dad, excited, got, maybe have their own place, and feeling like a true adult. And they have no expectations, and they work through the situation, and they have a great season. They come back their sophomore year. Now nothing's new. They've been away from home. So that's not as exciting as before. They know how it's going to be a long season and the work that's going to go into it, and getting them excited sometimes can be tough. And I always try to watch guys their sophomore year because of that. But yeah, so I've seen guys change because of your upperclassmen, or guys who, as the book says, your believers, change guys, and after their freshman year, I get a better guy, a different guy than I had their freshman year. But well, look, I really appreciate the talk again, man, and we'll do it again next week.
All right, Cary. So I think that, we've covered a broad spectrum of topics and tried to relate it to, you know, all the building blocks that we've tried to piece together over the for the course of the first 10 chapters. This chapter again was how do you rally the herd? How do you bring things together? And how do you, introduce things? And, how do you have to have confidence, in, having faith that the believers and the people that buy in will actually spread that message to the new individuals and new performers in your program. And we're going to segue next week into the final two chapters. The next thing is, once you've established change and once you've made that switch, how do you keep it going? And that's always one of the most difficult things, right? Is once you find a path that works for you, works for your program, works for each one of your individuals. How do you sustain that? How do you keep it going? Because that's, a lot of times a lot of people don't put stock in, getting to the top is one thing, but actually maintaining the success and replicating the success year over year. And how do you avoid complacency? How do you avoid the temptation of being overconfident or things like that? I mean, that's one of the other critical pieces in not only enacting change but sustaining change. And so next week we're going to be getting into chapter 11, keeping the switch going. And we appreciate everyone that's been listening along. Excited to wrap up this book and head into a new book. If any of you have any thoughts of new books that you would want to introduce to the wrestling community that would be worthwhile, as far as, you know, talking about, pieces that would be critical in building, sustaining, growing a program, we're looking for that. Cary and I have been discussing a couple new books, but if you have any suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Um, Outside of that, we appreciate you listening in and we look forward to talking to you next week. Take care.